Before the retail park, before the pigeons in the water towers, before the mill names carved in stone above roller-shuttered doors that nobody reads anymore, there was a system, not a town, a system, and the town was just the part of it you could see. This is a story about how empires actually work, not the version with flags and speeches, the version with spindles and ledgers and a logic so clean and so cold that the people living inside it never quite saw it for what it was. Oldham no longer exists as it once did. That much is obvious to anyone who walks its valleys today, past the great brick mills going soft at the edges, past the heritage plaques bolted to the walls of storage units, past the retail park sitting on the ground where the last mill stood. The physical evidence of the collapse is everywhere. What is harder to find is the explanation that actually holds up. The story usually told about Oldham is a story about choices, bad ones. The town chose free trade over protection. It chose spinning mules over ring frames. It chose loyalty to a single industry over diversification. And when those choices caught up with it, the mills closed and the spindles stilled, and the town paid the price. That story is not wrong. It is just not deep enough, because underneath the choices is something that never gets named, a structure, a set of conditions so thoroughly arranged that the choices Oldham made were never really choices at all. They were the only rational responses available to a town that had been built, from the beginning, to serve a single purpose inside a much larger machine, and had never been designed to outlast that purpose. The machine was the British Empire, and Oldham was one of its most perfect moving parts. To understand what Oldham was built for, you have to understand what the empire needed in the middle of the 19th century. It needed cloth, enormous quantities of it, not fine cloth, not silk or linen, or anything that required skill and patience and small production runs. It needed the cheap, coarse, ordinary cotton that could clothe a laboring population from Bengal to Lagos to Jamaica, populations that the empire governed and taxed, and from which it extracted raw materials, and to which it sold finished goods in return. This was not incidental to the empire. It was the empire's operating model. Raw cotton came in from the American South, and later from India itself. It traveled to Lancashire. Lancashire turned it into cloth. The cloth traveled back out to every market the empire controlled or influenced. The profits flowed to the mill owners, to the machine makers, to the shareholders, and upward into the financial structures that held the whole arrangement together. For this model to work, the empire needed a production point, a place that could spin and weave at a scale and a cost that no rival could match. It needed that place to specialize completely, to commit everything to a single function so thoroughly that it could not easily pivot away from it, because a town that might at any moment redirect its capital into something else was a less reliable cog than one that had staked its entire existence on cotton. Oldham, as it turned out, was almost perfectly designed for this role. It had coal, it had no navigable river and no deep harbor and no existing aristocratic interest to slow things down or redirect investment elsewhere. It had flat, cheap land around the town center that nobody wanted for anything better. It had, in short, none of the advantages that create diversified economies and all of the conditions that produce a single industry boom. The men who built the mills were not making a mistake. They were responding rationally to every signal the market sent, and the market was sending those signals because the empire needed them to. Here is something the standard history of Oldham's rise tends to skip over. Before Oldham could spin cotton for the world had to need Oldham's cotton. And for much of the world to need Lancashire cloth, it had to not be making its own. India, in the 18th and early 19th centuries, had been producing some of the finest cotton textiles on earth for thousands of years. Dhaka muslin, calico from Calicut, fabrics so fine that European merchants in the 17th century described them as woven wind. India had not merely a cotton tradition, it had a cotton civilization. Generations of skilled weavers and dyers and traders whose work had supplied markets from the Mediterranean to Southeast Asia for centuries before a single Lancashire mill existed. By the middle of the 19th century, much of that industry was gone. It had not collapsed on its own. It had been systematically dismantled. The East India Company, and later the Crown, imposed a structure of tariffs and trade rules that made it almost impossible for Indian cloth to compete in British markets, while simultaneously forcing Indian markets open to British imports. Indian weavers who had once clothed the subcontinent found their own government, a government run from London, raising barriers against their products while flooding their home market with the cheaper machine-made output of Lancashire. The population that had once bought Indian cloth was nudged, pressured, and in time structurally compelled to buy Oldham's cloth instead. This is what Oldham's market actually was. Not a natural market that existed because Lancashire produced something genuinely superior, a constructed market, one that required the active suppression of existing industries in other parts of the empire to function, one that had been engineered, through policy and power, to send raw cotton to Lancashire and buy finished cloth back. Oldham did not earn its dominance in an open competition. It was handed a captive customer base by the machinery of imperial governance, and it spun that advantage into 16 million spindles and 360 mills and the largest concentration of cotton spinning capacity the world had ever seen. The most honest statement anyone made about Oldham during the years of its triumph came not from a mill owner or a politician, but from a simple mathematical observation about what the town actually produced. By the early years of the 20th century, Oldham was spinning more cotton than France and Germany combined. That sentence is always delivered as a measure of pride. It should also be delivered as a measure of exposure. France had other industries. Germany had other industries. A calamity in textiles would wound them. It would not kill them. Oldham had nothing else. Every economic activity in the town, the shops, the banks, the architects, the transport infrastructure, the housing market, existed to serve the mills or to serve the people who worked in them. When a member of the local establishment looked out across the valley of chimneys and saw prosperity, what he was actually seeing was total dependency dressed up as dominance. The empire had created a production point so specialized that it had become fragile at the moment it was most celebrated. And fragility of that kind has a very specific name in the study of how empires treat their components. It is called a monoculture. An agricultural monoculture is a field planted entirely with a single crop. It produces extraordinary yields in good conditions. It is catastrophically vulnerable to a single change in conditions, a new pest, a drought, a shift in the market for that one crop, because it has eliminated every source of resilience in the name of maximum efficiency. Oldham was an industrial monoculture, and the empire had tended it as one, extracting maximum output from the specialization while quietly leaving the town without the structural depth that would have allowed it to survive when the conditions changed. Now here is where the story acquires a quality that most histories of industrial decline prefer not to sit with too long. Oldham knew it was exporting its own competition, not vaguely. Specifically, Platt Brothers, the great machine-making firm that at its height employed more than 15,000 people and supported nearly half the population of the town, did not merely supply Lancashire, it supplied the world. Its fitters traveled to India and Japan and Brazil. Its plans became the blueprints for rival industries. Its machines were the machines that would one day destroy the market those machines had been built to serve. This was not ignorance. It was a calculation. The machine-making trade was profitable. The overseas orders were large, and the doctrine of free trade, the governing ideology of Oldham's leading men, the religion of John Platt, and the political class he represented, held that selling to all buyers was not merely profitable, but morally correct. The market should be open. The best and cheapest producer should win. What Lancashire made better than anyone, it should sell to everyone. That was the creed. What the creed did not account for was the possibility that Lancashire's advantage was not permanent, that the skills could be transferred, that the machines could be copied and improved, that the labor costs that made Oldham competitive in 1880 would not make it competitive in 1920 or 1930 once its own machines had been turned against it. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from being the best at something for long enough. It becomes indistinguishable from the belief that you will always be the best. And in Oldham, that confidence had had decades to harden into certainty. The town did not merely ignore the warning signs. It helped create them, with both hands, at a healthy profit, right up to the moment the door closed. This is the moment, right around here, where someone watching this is forming a counter-argument. The objection usually runs something like this. Oldham's problem was that it failed to modernize. If it had adopted the ring frame earlier, if it had moved away from the spinning mule before the advantage was gone, it could have competed. The decline was not inevitable. It was a failure of industrial leadership. That argument is not wrong. It is just not asking the right question. The right question is, why didn't Oldham modernize? The answer is not stubbornness or stupidity. The answer is that modernizing was extraordinarily difficult for a town structured the way Oldham was structured. The Oldham Limiteds, the famous system of worker-owned shares that spread mill ownership across the whole population, were one of the most remarkable economic innovations of the Victorian era. A town of small capitalists who employed one another. Genuinely extraordinary. But that same structure meant that a decision to retool, to write off existing machinery and replace it with ring frames, required agreement from hundreds of small shareholders who had their life savings invested in the old technology and had no reason to believe their investment was not still sound. The distributed ownership that made Oldham unusually democratic also made it unusually resistant to the kind of swift, painful capital reallocation that technological transitions require. The system that had given the town its peculiar genius had also built in its peculiar inability to adapt. The First World War did not cause Oldham's decline. It accelerated a process that was already running, but it accelerated it in a way that removed any realistic prospect of recovery. While Lancashire's mills turned their attention to war production, the markets they had been supplying, India above all, still needed cloth. The mills of Japan and India, which had spent decades learning from Lancashire machinery and Lancashire-trained engineers, stepped into the gap. For 4 years, they had a captive customer and no competition from the source that had previously dominated. 4 years is long enough to build skill, long enough to establish relationships, long enough to develop a commercial infrastructure that does not disappear when the original supplier comes back. When the war ended and Lancashire tried to reclaim its old markets, it found that reclaiming was not the right word. The markets were occupied by competitors who had cheaper labor, newer machinery, no debt burden from wartime recapitalization, and no intention of yielding. And then came the cruelest turn. India, the single largest market Lancashire had ever known, was changing. Politically, socially, fundamentally. The independence movement that Gandhi was building was not merely a political project, it was an economic one. The spinning wheel, the charkha, became one of the central symbols of Indian self-determination, precisely because it represented the rejection of Lancashire cloth. To spin your own was to refuse the product of your colonizer. To burn foreign cloth was to burn the architecture of dependency that the empire had constructed. The market that the empire had built by suppressing Indian weaving was now being reclaimed by the same logic in reverse. India had not forgotten what had been taken from it, and the political will to rebuild what had been dismantled was bound up, inseparably, with the will to be free. Oldham had not merely sold cloth to India, it had sold cloth to a system of governance that had cleared the ground for that cloth by force. When that system of governance began to crack, the market cracked with it. Right now, if you are watching this in a room somewhere, and the probability is that the device you are watching on was made in a country that followed a version of the same logic that ended Oldham, this is the moment in the story where the past and the present stop feeling like separate things, because Oldham is not an isolated case. It is a template. The collapse of Oldham's cotton industry was not a sudden event. It was a long, grinding, slow-motion catastrophe that stretched across 5 decades, which in some ways was worse than a sudden blow would have been. Between 1924 and 1934, British cotton exports fell by almost half. Companies that had been worth millions were suddenly worth their machinery for scrap. The Lancashire Cotton Corporation, a body created with Bank of England backing in 1929, was not a rescue organization. It was a demolition firm, set up specifically to buy failing companies and close them, to manage the industry's death in an orderly fashion rather than letting it collapse in chaos. There is something extraordinary about that. A national institution, backed by the central bank of the world's largest empire, whose primary function was shutting down what had recently been the world's most productive cotton industry. And then, in 1959, Parliament passed the Cotton Industry Act. Its central mechanism was this: the government would pay mill owners to destroy their own machinery. Millions of spindles were bought by the state and scrapped. The logic was that the industry had more capacity than it would ever again need, and that excess capacity was an obstacle to any rational plan for what remained. The empire's most celebrated industry, the one that had clothed the world, was being paid to break itself apart. The scale of what was lost in this period is difficult to hold in the mind. One government minister told Parliament in the late 1950s that 300 mills had closed and 50,000 jobs had vanished in barely 4 years. Through the 1960s and 70s, a Lancashire mill closed on average almost once a week. Once a week, somewhere in the region, the whistle blew for the last time, and the machines went quiet, and the men and women who had given their working lives to the trade walked out and did not come back. Elk Mill opened in 1928. It was the largest textile factory Oldham had ever built, a cathedral of spinning mules, holding more than 100,000 spindles, the crowning achievement of the industry at the very moment the industry was beginning to die. It was also, in a detail almost too precise to be accidental, filled with spinning mules rather than ring frames. The newer, cheaper, more adaptable technology that the rest of the world had adopted was passed over in favor of the machine that Oldham had always used, the machine that Oldham knew. The machine that the town's most skilled workers had mastered across generations. It is not difficult to understand why. The knowledge was in their hands, the pride was in the craft, and the economic argument for sticking with what you know, when you know it better than anyone, is not irrational on its face. What makes it tragic is the pace at which the world stopped caring how well you knew it. Elk Mill was modernized repeatedly over the following 70 years. It outlasted almost everything around it. It remained the last commercial cotton mill in a town that had once held more than 360 of them. And in 1998, 70 years after it opened, it could no longer compete with imported yarn. Its owners cited an industry the government had declined to protect, and the last shift ended. The following year, Elk Mill was demolished. On the site where it stood, there is now a retail park. If you go to Oldham now, the evidence is still there. Not in museums, in the landscape itself. Mill after mill still stands across the valleys. Tall brick structures, far too solid to tear down cheaply, repurposed as apartments or warehouses or storage units. Names carved in stone above doors that now roll up to reveal pallet racking and delivery vans. Water towers that once fed the boilers standing empty against the northern sky. Buddleia growing from the brickwork. There is a mill named Zenith. Its owners chose that name during the good years, when naming a building after the highest point anything can reach seemed like confidence rather than hubris. Zenith Mill has been gone for years. On the ground where it stood, there is a DIY superstore. These details are not merely sad, they are diagnostic. A civilization that loses a single industry in a diversified economy absorbs the blow and continues. A civilization that has been structured around a single function that has been shaped over generations to serve one purpose inside a larger system, does not simply adapt when that purpose is removed. It loses something closer to its reason for being: the knowledge that built Oldham, the feel for a running thread, the ability to read a laboring machine, the particular intelligence that came from decades inside the mills, became worthless almost overnight. Not because it was not real knowledge, because the system that had given it value had moved on and was not coming back. That is the Empire's final gift to the towns it built. When it is done with you, it leaves you with skills that only made sense inside it. Here is the piece of this story that almost never gets told. The same year Elk Mill opened, 1928, the peak of Oldham's last ambition, Platt Brothers paid £100,000 for the patent rights to a Japanese invention, an automatic loom, designed by a man named Sakichi Toyoda. That payment gave the Toyota family the capital they needed to pivot away from textiles entirely. They used it to start a motor company, the firm that would eventually become Toyota, one of the largest manufacturers on Earth, one of the central pillars of the Japanese industrial economy that outcompeted Lancashire across the second half of the 20th century, was seeded in part by money from Oldham. Platt Brothers, the company that had armed the world's cotton mills, that had sent its fitters to India and Japan and Brazil to train the rivals that would one day close Lancashire's trade, reached out one final time and helped fund the birth of one of the great industrial powers of the century that followed. Oldham did not merely lose the future, it paid for it. That is the saves moment in this story. Screenshot it if you want it. The specific mechanism by which a dying industrial town helped capitalize the very economy that made its continued existence impossible. There is a word for that in the study of how empires manage their components. The word is extraction, and it runs in both directions. On the way up, the empire extracts the town's labor and capacity. On the way down, the town's remaining capital flows out toward the next arrangement, the next cheap point, the next specialized production center, the next place that can be built up and run hard and eventually outgrown. Oldham was not a failure. Oldham was a success, for exactly as long as the system needed it to be one. How many places are currently living inside this architecture? How many towns, in how many countries, have been built around a single function inside a global supply chain? One product, one market, one moment of comparative advantage, and are calling it prosperity. The logic that built Oldham is not historical, it is structural. It does not belong to the 19th century. It belongs to any moment when a global system needs a production point, builds one, extracts maximum value from its specialization, and leaves behind no mechanism for what happens when the extraction is complete. The men who ran Oldham's mills were not fools. The workers who owned shares in those mills were not naive. They were responding rationally to the conditions they inhabited. The conditions were the problem. The conditions had been designed, not by anyone in Oldham, but by forces operating at a scale that the view from a Lancashire hillside could not easily see. Standing on that cold Pennine Hill today, 700 feet up, looking out at the brick towers going soft in the rain, it is possible to see Oldham clearly for the first time, not as a cautionary tale about bad choices, as a case study in what empires do to the places they build. They build them to last exactly long enough. If this kind of story holds you, the hidden architecture beneath the famous rise, the question of who actually benefits when a place becomes the best in the world at one thing, then this channel is the place to keep looking. What we do here is find the empires that don't get statues, the systems underneath the history, the towns that were brilliant and expendable at exactly the same time. Consider subscribing. The next story is already there, and if you want to fall into another one right now, the video on your screen goes somewhere you will not expect. YouTube chose it for a reason. Go. In Manchester, behind glass, in a museum that most visitors pass through on the way to something else, there is a spinning mule from one of the last Oldham mills. Children walk past it without stopping. It does not move. It is the machine that clothed the world. It is the machine that taught the world to build machines. It is the machine that made 16 million spindles turn in a single cold English town, and then, one by one, stop. What the label on the case does not say, what no label on any exhibit anywhere quite manages to say, is that the machine was never really Oldham's. It was the Empire's machine, located in Oldham, for a while.